Thank you. Hope you can hear me. Yes, we have the great pleasure to welcome for this keynote session Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejias. As you know, Nick is professor of media and communications and social theory at the London schools, at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Ulises is professor at the State University of New York at Oswego. Together, they published a quite influential book, The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. I don't know if you can no, problem. Well, I have the book and it is a fantastic book, believe me. So this book has succeeded in putting the notion of data colonialism at the forefront of academic debates at an international scale. And we thought with Philippe and Christine that in this respect, it was a good way, and we must say a quite provocative way for introducing this workshop. Nick and Ulises, it's a privilege to have you here. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ulises will need to share his screen, and you can, hopefully you can do that. Ah, good, perfect. Good, well, thank you very much, Tristan, Christine, and Philippe for your kind introduction and for, inviting us to give a keynote to this fascinating conference. Shame we can't be with you in Paris, but before too long, hopefully. And we're going to introduce our concept and our framework of data colonialism shortly. But first of all, some introductory quotations, which offer a much broader perspective on how we can think about platforms. That is, understanding platforms as large-scale systems of data collection. Because, and this is important to emphasize, Ulises and I understand platforms not from the perspective particularly of economics, although they are important there, or from the perspective of management, and also not from the more anthropological perspective of the local social purposes to which people, of course, put the platforms that they have available to them. But instead, we try and look at platforms from the perspective of basically social theory. We see them as a mechanism for configuring, reconfiguring social interactions so that corporate value can for the first time be extracted directly from social interactions in the form of data. It's a truly revolutionary transformation of what social interactions are. And the three quotations we want to share with you come from very different periods. Yes, the first is from a strategy document, very recent one, the European Strategy for Data by the European Community, where amongst many similar statements, they say that data is the lifeblood of economic development, a very common way of thinking in development today, but also in general corporate discourse. So from that point of view, the collection of data just is the starting point for something good, which is economic development. I want to juxtapose that with two other quotes, which come from a different time. One comes from the founder of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, writing in the introduction to the original edition of cybernetics. Ulises, could you just also put this? Thank you. This comes from the 1947 introduction to cybernetics as the front cover. We're discussing the atomic bomb and connected computers. He draws a parallel and he argues that we're talking about the atomic bomb, but he says that he has actually been for some time thinking about an even greater social transformation, which comes from the connection of computers as a form of nervous system for human life. And he says that we are here with computers in the presence of a social potentiality of unheard of importance for good and for evil. And he finishes his preface by saying his prediction is that the bad will win out. That was written in 1947, but it was a warning that has been almost completely forgotten in thinking about the impact of artificial intelligence and more basically of the connection of computers for the extraction of data for the management of social life. It's picked up, though, in a recent book about artificial intelligence by Stuart Russell, one of the leading thinkers in the field, the book Human Compatible, where he focuses in particular on using data to manage human behavior, as we know many marketers are doing, as we know Facebook explicitly does, where he says, looking a little way further into the future, that when future machines have an even greater understanding of human psychology, beliefs, and motivations, it should then become relatively easy for them to gradually guide us in directions that increase the degree of satisfaction of the machine's objectives, which was exactly the thing that Norbert Wiener was afraid of back in 1947. And Russell also quotes Wiener, a different passage from the great book Cybernetics. So these three quotations, I think, provide a starting point for us now to introduce to you the argument of our book, The Cost of Connection, which we believe offers a new perspective for considering platforms from the perspective of the global south in the context of wider global geopolitical relations. So the question that we pose in our book, The Cost of Connection, is basically very simple. The question is, what is going on with data on the broadest scale? How, in other words, should we frame in the broadest way the countless new and not so new developments with data in business, in government, in society, and in daily life? These are developments for sure that have been accelerated by the living conditions under the global pandemic, under which we still suffer, of course. Now, there are many ideas on the table. Most of them focus on saying this is some new development with capitalism. Maybe it's a digital capitalism, which perhaps doesn't tell us a lot, or an informational capitalism, or maybe more specifically a platform capitalism, Nick Cernicek's idea. That's an important concept. Or most famously, surveillance capitalism from Shoshana Zuboff, or most simply, data capitalism. All those ideas contribute something important, particularly surveillance capitalism and platform capitalism. But in our book, we ask, is there something potentially even larger going on with data? Something truly momentous in world history, which will be a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. We got some hints of this in the business cliches of the past 5 years. For example, this front cover of The Economist magazine from May 2017, which used the phrase in its leading article that data is the new oil. Oil, of course, paradigmatically being a colonial asset. So is this phrase, data is the new oil, is it just a harmless metaphor? Or is this phrase, this metaphor, precisely the disguise, the cover for a genuinely new reality that deserves the name colonialism, whose actual workings need to be disguised, if at all possible, to hide them from our view? The possibility of a colonial framing of what's going on with data emerged in popular discourse in the notorious Cambridge Analytica scandal from 3 years ago, which I'm sure you all remember. But basically, Cambridge Analytica, a small company, was able to use Facebook-generated data to draw up psychological profiles of hundreds of thousands of users, and then to target those Facebook users with political propaganda. The insider who broke the scandal, Christopher Wiley, a few weeks into the scandal, when he was asked about Cambridge Analytica's plans to influence politics in India as well, said on Twitter, "This is what modern colonialism looks like." But what could this actually mean?
So a central point in our argument is actually that this is not just a metaphor. We are using the word colonialism not metaphorically or allegorically, but to describe an emerging reality. We are essentially talking about a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism, what we call data colonialism. And this emerging phase is preparing the ground, basically, for a new mode of capitalist production, just like colonialism prepared the ground for industrial capitalism. If we think, for instance, of the wealth generated in the plantations as eventually financing the emergence of factories. At the same time, we are arguing that this is coexisting, of course, with neo-colonial legacy, with the inequalities created during colonialism, the legacy of underdevelopment, of racism, of violence, and so on. So are we suggesting perhaps that we can expect to see the same level of physical violence that we saw under colonialism at a global level? No, we're not. We're not making a one-to-one comparison between historical colonialism and data colonialism. But we are saying that the impact of the social change is comparable. We're perhaps talking about different means, but similar ends. At this point, I think it would be useful to present to you the official definition of data colonialism, as Nick and I presented in our book. We say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. Now, to make sense of this definition, it is also useful to differentiate between colonialism and coloniality, the latter being a term developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And to summarize his complex argument, I'll just say that for him, the point was that even if we admit that colonialism is over, that there are no more colonies, that colonies cut their independence, and of course, it might depend who we ask about this. Our friends in Puerto Rico or Palestine might not agree that colonialism is over. But even if we agree that by and large, there are no more colonies, Quijano's point was that the legacy of colonialism continues to shape power relations. It continues to shape race relations, even the way we generate and construct knowledge. So that's what coloniality implies. So we are saying that there are differences, important differences, between historic colonialism and data colonialism. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales, of course, the context. We should keep those differences in mind. But we are saying that there is one clear and very important similarity, and that is the historical function of colonialism is the same, and that function is to dispossess, to extract. The old colonialism grabbed land. The new one grabs us, our social lives, through this new medium of digital data. But how is this being rationalized? One of the reasons this new emerging order is very effective is because it is based on rationalities that have deep colonial roots, whether those are legal, technological rationalities, they have a deep colonial past. Let's begin, for instance, with the notion of cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, the colonizer had to frame nature as cheap. It was supposed to be abundant. Nature was supposed to be free. From a legal perspective, it was supposed to be without owner, at least a civilized owner. That's what the concept of terra nullius implies, no man's land. The idea that the colonizer could arrive at the so-called New World, and because it wasn't inhabited by civilized humans, they could take that land. From there, of course, we see a progression from cheap nature to cheap labor. In colonialism, some human beings, and this was mostly determined by race, as we know, they were meant to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. And as we also know, that meant that exploitation and abuse and genocide were framed basically as social progress. It was good for humanity. If we follow this progression, we can see that from cheap nature we moved to cheap labor, and now, of course, to cheap data, which, if you think about it, has many of the same extractive rationalities we saw with nature and with labor. It is supposed to be abundant. It is supposed to be without an owner. Yes, you and I produce it individually, but in order to derive benefit from it, it's like oil. It needs to be processed, refined. And the companies that have the advanced technology to do that are the ones who benefit. Our only job is to generate it. And again, we are told that this is what progress looks like. But what exactly do we gain by looking at things this way?
Yes, we do realize that it may be unsettling to compare what's going on with data, both in the global South and the global North, with colonialism. So I want to right away try and summarize what we see as the advantages of this approach, so you can get an overview. And there are basically two types of advantages, we think: advantages of scope and advantages of depth. So first, scope. A colonial approach to what's happening with data means understanding it in terms of not just the past 40 years in which not just platforms, but the internet has been developed, but the past 500 years of the relations between colonialism and capitalism. And it also means looking far into the future, seeing data extraction today as historically a fundamental new form of resource extraction, but also potentially the preparation for the next stage of capitalism, just as historic colonialism paved the way for industrial capitalism fully 200 years later. The colonial approach also widens our sense of the scope of what's actually going on through the extraction of data, where it's going on. So we're not just talking about social media platforms. We're talking about the massive expansion of surveillance, data-driven surveillance of workers in all forms of workplace, especially less well-paid workers, especially those of lower status. We're looking exactly at the expansion of the gig economy and platforms, but seen as ways of extracting value at a distance of unparalleled force, working again through data extraction. We're looking at the expansion over the past 3 or 4 decades of logistics. Of course, we all benefit from logistics so that our packages arrive on time. But the packaging, the tracking of things in logistics always involves the tracking of the person who moves the things. So reinforcing the tendencies to a massive increase of the surveillance of workers. And then finally, most neglected of all, we include within data colonialism, the rise of the extraction of internal corporate data. It was IBM, not often thought of as one of the titans of big tech, IBM, who in their 2016 annual report said that 80% of the world's most valuable data lies inside corporations. And the question of what is inside a corporation is quite interesting, because if you own a smart fridge or a smart doorbell, then the movements of milk in and out of your fridge, which you may think is part of your personal life, and who turns up to your door and whether you answer or not, which again, you might thought is very much part of your personal life, are already data internal to the corporations which provided those smart systems. So that's advantages of scope. But a colonial approach also, we believe, deepens our sense of what is achieved through the extraction of data. And we argue this is a genuinely new social order, just as with colonialism, which completely changed our modes of social organization. We have emerging new forms of dependency and rule, governance, based, of course, on nice things, always the offer of nice things, convenience, customization, what marketers call personalization, but at the very same time reinforcing older inequalities, most of them inherited from colonialism, of class, gender, and race. And then finally, a decolonial approach also enables us to see what's going on with data, to see the discourse of big data as a continuation of something very deep within colonialism, which is the West's long-term attempt to impose one single version of rationality on the world. This is the deepest colonial continuity of all, the deep entanglement of power and knowledge, of power and rationality throughout modernity, entanglements that, of course, as many decolonial theories have argued, lie right at the heart of coloniality and its ability to impose itself upon the world, and which we see also, in our view, right at the heart of the discourses of big data. So those are the overall advantages of the argument, and they may, and hopefully, they'll enable you to get an overview of what we're saying. But let's now look in a little bit more detail at how data colonialism actually works, which means, as we said, seeing what's happening with data as part of the ongoing relations between colonialism and capitalism. So that means it's not enough just to look at decolonial theory. We also have to look back to the most important theorist of capitalism of them all, Karl Marx. As you'll remember, it was labor relations that, for Marx, are the social engine for reproducing capitalism. And of course, they're still important. They're increasingly being datafied, as I just said. But we argue that this emerging social order, that is the order of data colonialism, cannot be understood fully, or maybe even primarily, through labor relations. And the reason is very simple. We understand it, if you like, at those moments at the end of a week when we are definitely not working, when we are with our friends, relaxing, eating, swapping pictures of food, happy moments together with our family and friends, when we know we are not working. But at that very same moment, we should know that we remain part of the order of data colonialism, the order of extracting data or metadata from our attempts to relax after work. That means we have to understand this new order through a new type of social relation that works in parallel with labor relations, which we call data relations. Data relations are ways of reproducing social life, configuring social interactions for one new end, which is to optimize the extraction of data from them for profit, for value. And we're able to make that extension, a creative extension, we believe, to Marx's fundamental social theory by drawing on the work of the late Moishe Postone, who argued that the fundamental characteristic of capitalism, as it moves into an era which Marx could never have anticipated, is not labor relations. It's not even the commodification of activity which makes possible labor relations. It's something which makes possible commodification itself, which is abstraction, the abstracting force that makes the commodity possible. In other words, the possibility of transforming life processes in all their messiness and untidiness and open-endedness into things that can be sold on a market because they are things with potential value. And in this way, we can see that datafication, through datafication, ordinary social life becomes a direct factor, as Marx put it, a factor of capitalist production. And Marx actually provides us with a model of this when he talks about how seeds and manure that until capitalism had lain on the ground and then got woven back into the production process of the farmer without any money changing hands, under capitalism, have to be sold on the market back to the farmer, having been taken from the land. In the same way, we are arguing that our natural relation to our own lives is being disturbed by this new form of abstraction of data, with the result that human life, for the first time in history, can be fully annexed directly to capitalism through continuous monitoring and influence of ourselves by larger corporations in a way that we argue, although we don't have time to develop this, threatens the very possibility of liberty, this very space of the self which can be free. But always in the ways that, because they reproduce the ongoing legacy of historical colonialism, hurt most those who suffered under historical colonialism too. That's a complex picture, I acknowledge. It's a complex theoretical framework. But in another way, our relation to data colonialism is very simple. We all know on a daily basis how data relations happen. Every time we accept the terms and conditions of an app on our phone, every time we accept the terms of service of a platform or a smart device, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. And we usually do this quite peacefully, which leads to a crucial point that Ulises has already hinted at, but that we want to emphasize. Because surely you might be thinking, this is the big difference from historical colonialism. Where is the violence? This can't be colonialism. There is not the same violence that we know was associated with that. But then this is the crucial point. Historical colonialism was built on absolutely no prior social relations, which meant there were only two ways of taking the gold for the conquistadors: brutal physical violence and deception. And of course, they use both. But today's new mode of colonialism, data colonialism, if we're correct to interpret that way, builds, of course, on 2 centuries of capitalism. It builds on 2 centuries of all of us getting used to capitalist social relations, which means that just a small adjustment in the legal terms that govern the background operations of our mobile phones is enough to change our relation to the stuff of our lives. No physical violence actually necessary.
So who is behind this process? In the book, we didn't want to just talk about internet companies in a general or generic way, or Silicon Valley. So we came up with the label of the social quantification sector. The SQS is the industry sector devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for this kind of extraction that we've been talking about. And so, yes, we definitely want to talk about the big ones, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, as well as their Chinese counterparts, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, which equal and parallel in many ways the reach and power of some of their Western counterparts. One interesting feature of these big players is that they often act as monopsony hybrids. So they're not just monopolies being single sellers of these technologies, being able to set the price as high as they want. They're also monopsonies or single buyers of all of the data that we produce, which means they can set the prices as low as they want. And of course, there are other players in this sector beyond the big ones, which I think it is a necessity that we should focus on, not just the big ones though, but the players of all different sizes, whether we're talking about hardware manufacturers or software developers, yes, the platforms that we have been discussing, but also the companies that focused on data analytics and data brokerage, collecting data, analyzing it, reformatting it, and then selling it to a third party. And of course, this environment is, at least in the United States, not regulated at all. So the point here is that there are other players, and we're trying to expand our reach to everything, not just surveillance. But let's talk a little bit more specifically about the coloniality of data relations. And in the book, what we do is we conduct various transhistorical comparisons using the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. And we organize these examples using the same 4X game plan found in strategy video games. And those 4 X's are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. These are the same strategies that you can apply when you play a video game, such as the one you see in the background here, which is part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. This is Colonialism, the video game. In this game, you can play the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese or the Dutch, I forget which one. And your goal is to go around the world and apply the same four strategies: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate, to conquer the world. The world, of course, and its inhabitants are controlled by the computer. They're not fully sentient beings. We don't have time to explore all four strategies, so I will just focus on two. Let's start with explore. Here, what I want to do is compare two documents. The first one is a contemporary document. It's the terms of service for Google Chrome. And in case you, like most of us, have not read these terms of service, when you install Google Chrome, here's what it says in part. Quote, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. In other words, whether you realize it or not, when you install Google Chrome, you give Google permission to do all of these things. The other much older document I want to compare this to is a document called the requerimiento, which in Spanish means something like the demand or the requirement. This was a document read by Spanish conquistadors as they were about to enter a village or a city in the New World to pillage it and conquer it and do all of what they were doing. And they would sometimes arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness and stand well outside the limits of the village or the city and proceed to read this document in Spanish to an audience that obviously did not speak Spanish. The document said in part, quote, but if you do not submit to Spanish rule, that is, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of your highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That is the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install over there. Now, our point is not to suggest that what happened after the Requerimiento was read is the same thing that happens after we install Google Chrome. But we want to call attention here to the use of this misleading, abstract language that nobody can understand to conduct the initial trick, so to speak, of dispossession, of extraction. Let me briefly touch on the extermination function, because we already know that data is being used to make life and death decisions, although these impacts are sometimes difficult to see. So we do want to acknowledge that there is violence in data colonialism, although it might operate in different ways. For instance, it might operate at the symbolic level, because data colonialism, what it exterminates are alternative forms of thinking and of being. Colonialism has always attempted to colonize the mind, not just the body. But undoubtedly, we are continuing to see physical violence in data colonialism because it continues, as we said, the legacy of racist, sexist, environmental, and class violence that we have seen. And I will just present one example, which is that of the algorithm recently found in the United States in the healthcare sector. This was an algorithm used by hospitals and by insurance companies to determine the subsequent level of care patients should get. And it was found through a study that the algorithm was racist, which means it wasn't suggesting extra care for African-American patients as often as it was for white patients. And this was an algorithm that was used and affected millions of Black people in the United States. So the violence there was very much real and operating at both the symbolic and physical level. All right, just to wrap it up. how do we even begin to resist it? How do we begin to decolonize data? And we want to offer just a few observations or suggestions of ways we could perhaps begin to think about this. The first one is that if we look at this problem in the context of 500 years of history, we know that one-track approaches are not going to work. So yes, we need to put pressure on our governments to regulate the industry. We need, perhaps, if we can afford to opt out of individual platforms. But by themselves, these actions are not going to be enough. We need to think at a bigger level. We need to reclaim, in some ways, colonized space and time in order to protect the space of the self. So the space colonized perhaps by surveillance cameras in our public spaces. The space colonized perhaps by digital assistants in our kitchens, in our bedrooms even. We need to find ways of reclaiming that space. And also the time colonized essentially by screens that we spend in front of a screen interacting with these platforms. At a broader level, we're suggesting that we need to reject this universal, so-called divine mandate of the rationality that says that data collection must continuously be extracted. And here, of course, we can present the alternatives, and we can talk later about initiatives such as Tierra Común or the non-aligned technology movements that are attempting to create networks of support for figuring out how to do that. All of this, of course, we need to do while recognizing that data colonialism has very specific overdetermined targets. So whether we're looking at the issue of race and the work already done by Noble and Benjamin, or the issue of class, as Virginia Eubanks has written on, or gender, as Ignacio and Klein, or even specifically indigenous rights, as Ricardo writes about. Some populations in data colonialism continue to pay a heavier price, and so we need to look specifically at those instances. Lastly, I think we need to learn from past and present decolonization struggles. There are peoples with long histories of resisting colonialism, and we can learn from them. We can learn how to reappropriate different technologies, perhaps. We can learn different models of constructing common knowledge, different ways of solidarity, of connection, all by using a crucial tool in the fight against colonialism. And that weapon, that tool, is imagination. When it hasn't been possible to resist colonialism with the body, it has been at least possible to resist it with the mind. Decolonizing data, we argue, is primarily an exercise in creativity, collectively imagining what disconnecting looks like, but also what new forms of connection might look like. Thank you very much.